So at this point, we're quite used to the idea of using sine or using cosine or using tangent. Just as a quick recap, when we've got a right angled triangle, we show that it's a right angled triangle by putting the square in the corner. We'll have an angle that's been labelled, usually with the Greek letter theta. And then we can use that angle to decide what to call or how to label the three sides of the triangle. The longest side that is opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse, and we shorten that to hype. The side that is opposite to the angle theta is called the opposite. We shorten that just to op. And the side that is next to the marked angle theta, or you could say it's in between the two angles that we've got there, the right angle and theta, that's called the adjacent, and we shorten that to adj. So, depending on which sides we've been given in the question, or which sides we need to find, we use a different formula. The first formula I introduced you to was the sine formula. On your calculator, that's shortened to sin, and the formula is sin theta equals opposite divided by the hypotenuse. That's the length of the opposite side divided by the length of the hypotenuse side. The next ratio is called the cosine ratio, shortened to cos on your calculator, and the cosine for an angle is found by dividing the adjacent side by the hypotenuse side. And finally, we have the tangent ratio, and that's just abbreviated to tan on your calculator, and tan theta is the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. Okay, so we've got these three formulas. You can remember them as formula triangles. Personally, I don't use formula triangles, but I know a lot of people do. So sin OH CAH and TOA. So if you prefer to remember the formula triangles, that's absolutely fine. I remember when I first learned trigonometry, I remembered them using a mnemonic. A mnemonic is when we have a word or a phrase that helps us remember the order that something goes in. So, the mnemonic that I most commonly use, or the mnemonic that I always use to be honest, is SOHCAHTOA. S-O-H, so, C-A-H, ka, T-O-A, toa, SOHCAHTOA. S for sine, O for opposite, H for hypotenuse, C-A-H-T-A-O. There is another mnemonic to remember it, which involves writing it starting with tan, and you go across each one instead of through each one. So you'd go, the cat sat on an orange and howled horribly. I've always remembered that one because I thought it was funny, but I've never used it, if that makes sense. I've always used SOHCAHTOA, and in fact if you mention SOHCAHTOA to your parents, they'll probably remember that from maths, however long ago that was. So the idea is, when you've got a triangle, so let's have a triangle, and it's a right angle triangle, and you're trying to find the size of one of the sides. So for example here, if I had, this was x and this was 7, I'd say, okay, what sides have I got? I've got the opposite and I've got the adjacent. Now I know that is the hypotenuse, but there's no point labelling it because it's not interesting to me. There is no information on the hypotenuse. I don't know what it is, and I don't need to know what it is, so I'm not going to bother labelling it. I'm only labelling the sides that are relevant to this question. Some people like to label all the sides and then cross out the one they're not using. Up to you. So this is where a highlighter is really useful, such as one of these. Highlight all of the O's because we've got the opposite. Highlight all of the A's because we've got the adjacent. This highlighter's twisted. Which one has got the most highlighted? TOA. So because of that, we're going to use tan. So then we'd write the formula out for tan and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go through a full example. What I am going to do is go through that process with you lots of times. that will help you to get the idea of what we need to do. So I'm going to go through these quite quickly. I'm not going to work out any of the length x. I'm literally just going to show you which formula we would use. So here's my first one. So look where my angle is and think about it. I don't need the hypotenuse, that's not interesting to me. 15 is opposite 67, so that's the opposite. X is next to 67, so that's the adjacent. I write out SOHCAHTOA. And I get my rubbish highlighter and I'm looking at the adjacent and the opposite, and I'm going to use tan. So that one would be a tangent ratio question. Let's have a look at the next one. So I always start with hypotenuse. I don't know why, it's just I find it the easiest one. So x is the hypotenuse, so I'm going to label that as the hypotenuse. 12 is next to the angle 72, so that's next to, that means it's adjacent. So I write out my SOHCAHTOA. You won't have to write out SOHCAHTOA forever, by the way. Once you get more used to it, you might find yourself not needing to. That's great, but don't rush towards that step. At the end of the day, it is only 9 letters. So hype, H and H, A, adjacent, and the bit that's got the most highlighted is K, so we're going to use cosine for that triangle. Next triangle, we've got an angle of 65. So x is the hypotenuse. That one's, like I said, I always find that one the easiest one. And 8 is opposite 65. So 8 is the opposite side. This would be the adjacent, but I don't care. It's not any information I need. So we write out SOHCAHTOA. And we get our highlighter. I need to stop putting the lid back on. We've got the hypotenuse, so we highlight both the H's, and we've got the opposite, O and O. So this time we're using SO. We're using the sine formula. Question 4 here. We've got x is the hypotenuse. Question 24 is next to the angle, so that's the adjacent. So when we write out our SOHCAHTOA and do our highlighting, H for the hypotenuse and A for the adjacent, we're interested in cos. So this is a cosine rule triangle. Number 5 down here, x is the hypotenuse and 18 centimetres is opposite the angle of 36 degrees. So when I write out my SOHCAHTOA, hypotenuse, opposite, I'm going to use sine. I don't know the hypotenuse for this one. 38 centimetres is opposite my angle. X is next to my angle. So when I write out my SOHCAHTOA, I highlight my A's because I've got the adjacent, and I highlight my O's because I've got the opposite, and TOA, so tan. For this question, again, I don't have the hypotenuse. I got the opposite, which is 22 centimetres, and I want to find the adjacent, which is x. SOHCAHTOA, I'm going to underline this time because I am getting lazy. O for opposite, A for adjacent, T for tangent. This question here, x is the hypotenuse. 22 is next to the angle, so it's the adjacent. So when I do my SOHCAHTOA, A for adjacent, H for hypotenuse, C for cosine. Number 9 down here, x is the hypotenuse. 8 is opposite my angle of 64, so that's my opposite. SOHCAHTOA, O for opposite, H for hypotenuse. So this is going to be a sine question. This question here, no hypotenuse, 44 is opposite the angle 68, x is next to the angle 68. So when I do my SOHCAHTOA, I've done that in green twice in a row. Oh well. I've broken my pattern. Tangent. I'm going to do the last one, this one in green as well, because I've messed it up now. I might as well continue. X is the hypotenuse because it's the longest side. 76 is next to the angle. I'm not interested in the side opposite the angle. When I write out my SOHCAHTOA, H for hypotenuse, A for adjacent, K, this is going to be a cosine question, cos. And last but not least, I'm going to switch back to red now because I've remembered. X is the hypotenuse, 57 is the angle, and 6 is opposite to it. So it's opposite. I don't care about the adjacent. Write out your SOHCAHTOA. O for opposite, H for hypotenuse, and this final question would be a sine formula. So each time you label the signs that you've got or that you want, you use SOHCAHTOA to identify which of the three formulas you're going to use.